podcast about product management, user experience design, technology, and more. This is Product by Design. All right, welcome to another episode of Product by Design. I am Kyle, and we've got another guest with us today, Dr. Bree Gentile, or Dr. G. Thank you for being with us. Welcome to the show, Dr. G.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
All right. We're excited to have you. Let me give a brief intro and then you can tell us more about yourself. But Dr. G is a trauma-informed psychologist turned trauma-informed product researcher and designer. So welcome to the show. Super excited to have you and to talk more about yourself and some of the work you've been doing. But why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I started out as a psychologist. And so I didn't start out as a UX researcher. So I have a little bit of a back pathway. But I originally got my first kind of design spot that came into my life was as an intern in my pre-doc. And so I was interning as a psycho-oncologist where I was working with cancer patients and their families. And I kept hearing in my sessions and group sessions that they were really scared to go for a second opinion because if they came back to their doctor after the second opinion, they were scared they wouldn't get good care. And I was like, wow, that's not cool. Not only should you ever have that opinion or fear of your doctor, but you shouldn't be dealing with that on top of cancer. And so I was like, maybe there's an app, I just started drawing stuff on a napkin and pieces of paper and had no idea that I was brainstorming at the time, but was just like, maybe there's an app that, people can connect to their doctors on things like they yoga, they prefer breath work, they're okay with cannabis, and they like ocean, walks or something, just different ways besides the way that they're connecting on insurance and specialty. And then I was like, maybe there's a way they could also break up with that doctor in a way that's very easy and not having this difficult conversation. And so I just started thinking about an interface that's similar to Tinder where you could just swipe your doctors and just, kind of go with that route. And so it was my first, like I said, my first kind of design thinking and first way of thinking about others in an app solving a problem. And so after that internship, all of my comrades were going off to do their licensing, and I knew I didn't want to do private practice, but I was really still wanting to do the interventions of private practice, right? I still wanted to help people. And I magically found, it was actually my mom. So thanks, Mom. I know she listens to every podcast I do. So thanks, Mom, for this. She introduced me to a startup company at the time called X2AI, which was a chatbot company that was creating chatbots to deliver evidence-based mental health. So I got in touch with somebody there and I was, super intrigued by a chatbot delivering mental health. And it wasn't the process that I was really intrigued by. It was the actual interventions that the chatbot would say that I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. So I designed a couple of conversations around loneliness and newly diagnosed breast cancer because it was really specific. And I think they just wanted to see kind of what I was all about. And, they were like, you probably aren't interested in an internship because, you're already almost well along your Ph.D. And I was like, oh, I'm very interested. So I started designing conversations for chatbots, which was whoa, super cool. And I found out that UX research was actually really interesting to me because I started looking at the logs, the conversation logs, mostly to see where our chatbot was missing conversations. But what was really interesting was I started to find out that there was a theme evolving, which was that a lot of the users wanted some sort of bigger purpose kind of talk or what's it all about kind of talk. And I was like, okay, so, and it was around the time of Easter and Lent for me as a Catholic. And so I was like, okay, let's just roll with this and let's just see what we can create. And so we created a Sister Hope was her name. And she was a Catholic nun. And she delivered, for the first part, she just delivered some pings around Lent, or how did you celebrate on Sunday? Just tiny things. And then I started to develop her more as a persona based on the user feedback. And she ended up helping 8th graders through confirmation, which was so cool. And she's still used at the Archdiocese in San Francisco, which is just mind blowing because I created her kind of almost as like a test or like a joke
Yeah.
to see like, do people really want to talk to a Catholic nun? And I was like, yeah, people do want to talk to a Catholic nun, especially if she's like an anonymous chatbot. So I was like, cool. So that was pretty fun. And I realized I really liked UX research. So again, miraculously kind of had this opportunity with as a contractor with Google to do some UX research on their hardware. And I was super excited because living in the Bay Area, it's kind of like Google and Facebook are the Wizard of Oz still, you know, and I was like, let's just see what's behind the curtain. So worked at Google on their hardware. So I was doing a lot of benchmarking studies on their keyboards and surfaces. So one of the most interesting things that came out of that experience was when I was doing some benchmarking studies on their Surface, the keyboard was one of the biggest frustrations on the Surface, except for the Apple, which we all know, like Apple does a wonderful job at their digital keyboard, right? Yeah. And the great thing that came from there was like, yeah, it was the size of the keys and the shape of the keys and the spacing, yada, yada. But it was making people feel smarter. Like the other keyboards were actually making people feel really dumb. And I thought that was like a big qualitative piece of like, okay, like Google, our Surface is making people feel stupid. On top of it being worse than Apple, we're making people feel dumb. But it wasn't an important piece to the stakeholders. And so it kind of just fell upon deaf ears. And that's when I realized like qualitative data was not really important at that team. And I didn't want to stay there because I knew in my heart that qualitative data was like the pinnacle of the research. Like quantitative data will tell the story, but the qualitative data is the story, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was just like, I got to leave. So I left Google. Everyone looked at me like I broke up with the quarterback. And I went to a nonprofit in the middle of Bayview, which is the last Black neighborhood in San Francisco. And I worked for $60,000 in the beginning, which is like peanuts in San Francisco when you're buying like people are buying homes for like 1.5 million, like closet. So that just gives you a little bit of perspective what $60,000 is for a PhD student. I was stoked though, because I started to do UX research in a way that nobody was talking about it at the organization. Like I couldn't talk about users because they were our families, they were clients. Mm-hmm. I couldn't talk about user journey, right? That was like their lived experience. So I had to learn a new way of talking about UX without losing the like sauce of it, because I started to create services. And so within that organization, we did like a whole ecosystem brainstorm on like, what happens once you go to the doctor and you get screened for adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. And then you're told like, okay, you now have ACEs and you're suffering from toxic stress. What do you do? So we brainstormed an answer to that question of like a whole ecosystem. And it was really fun to design that because of course it was like, you know, service designing and all these different journey maps. But it was the first time that I got to bring my skills to the organization, because I think a lot of times people feel like they have to go to an organization where their skills will be seen. And I think with UX, you have a little bit of wiggle room because you're really working with people and how they interact with things. You can go to an organization and say like, hey, I see that this skill isn't here, but this is what I have. And I think that it's super needed for the organization. So I stayed there and I continued to do my work, but I also recognized that I was still not complete. And I started to use, you know, different apps and just kind of being like, gosh, this is kind of busted, or like, man, this would be super cool if this was here. And then COVID came. And so work stopped, everything stopped. And we, you know, we're home. And then my grandfather actually passed away from COVID in 2020. And that hit me like, oh, wow, a ton of bricks. Yep. And so I was frustrated with the news app that I was using because I couldn't avoid COVID. I couldn't avoid that in any of the headlines. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go through my preferences and I'm going to unselect technology, unselect like pharmaceuticals. I'm just unselecting all of the things where I think COVID might show up. Well, it still shows up in sports. Somehow it still shows up in like fashion. Of course it shows up in travel. And I'm like, interior design, maybe I'll be safe. No, it, you know, it like shows up everywhere. And so I'm like, gosh, a news app that every time I log in that says, what topics bring you joy today? What topics do you not want to hear today? Can't I just do that every time I open the app? And so I just started thinking, nobody's really actually doing this human-centered design crap. They say they are, but they're actually not. Like, they're actually having 5 to 7 user interviews where they require the user to have their camera on, and they require them to be comfortable with things like mural board and moving screens and Post-its flying around. And then they say, great, thanks for your time. Here's your $150 gift card. Okay, cool. But what the heck happened to the insights I gave you? Like, did you create a product? Did you do something with it? Can I see it? Like, there's no feedback loop, right? And so I was just like, I guess I'm going to have to change this on my own. And I realized there's some land out there to be claimed. And so that's where I started Dr. G's lab. And I was like, I'm just going to be an advisor. I'm just going to start out as an advisor, maybe a strategic planner, maybe a mentor. And it grew. And I had no idea that there were people out there that were like, hey, I'm starting this app and I really need some help, but I only have like $500. And it's like, okay, cool. I can give you this much time and this much effort for $500. And it was about being accessible. It wasn't about being like, the Nielsen and Norman group that's out there that's like $5,000 an hour or something. And it's like, everyone's like, your value. And it was like, yeah, but this service is not available. It's not accessible for the people for the scrappy people, right? Who are just like, I want to do it right, but I have no idea what the heck I need. I don't know what I don't know. And so that's where I wanted to come into that space of like, you don't know what you don't know. I didn't know what I don't know. So let's just kind of figure this out together and see what you do need. And let's see if I can be of service. And if I can't, let me connect you. So that's what the lab was kind of all about, was just taking all of my lived experience and turning some frustrations into like a place where people can, either incubate their ideas, maybe accelerate them, but just have a space where they can actually, create. So yeah, that's where I am today.
That's an amazing backstory. And I absolutely love the entire journey that kind of brings everything to Dr. G's lab, the advising service that you offer and the experience that you give, because kind of like you said, not everybody is looking for the Nielsen Norman group to kind of advise on the UX experience. And, one, that's not what everybody needs. And two, it's not what everybody is looking for or can afford. So I want to pull on a whole bunch of threads that you've brought up, because I think this is just absolutely fascinating. But to kind of start, maybe you can touch a little bit on, how your background in psychology, and you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but how that and your work so far in what you've done and what you're doing, how that has shaped your approach in advising and consulting, and some of the design work that you've done and what you're doing and how you approach it with clients and applications and teams that you work with.
Yeah. So I'm hearing kind of a twofold answer. Mm-hmm. So one is how do I consult with the folks given my background, which is that, again, kind of thinking about like where everybody's coming from. I think that it's really important for consultants to think about your audience and where they're coming from, right? So I know that there's people out there who are starting an app out of passion, out of pure passion and their own savings account, right? And so I know that those folks are like, I have no clue what I need, or they're like, I need this, but I can't afford it. So that's where I come in. And I feel like that's a piece that consultants don't typically do. Typically, it's like, this is my price and that's it, right? Yeah. And so I think that that's a little bit different approach for me, given my psychology background, which is that, everybody is coming from a different starting point. And it's my job and my obligation to empower them. But first, in order to do that, I have to meet them where they are. I can't empower them from my place. I need to empower them from their place. So I guess that kind of goes into a little bit of the design work, but really in the design work it's pulling from the more of the theoretical pieces of psychology and not the practical pieces that I just touched upon. So, thinking about like the psychology of design, you start to think about the cognitive biases and the principles that affect your UX, right? So we talk about priming, for example. That's like previous stimuli will influence your user's decision. So if you put a button on one page, you put the same button on another page and another page, you might be thinking, gosh, this is obnoxious. Like I'm putting a connect with me button on every single one of my pages of my website. But that's priming, right? And so that's what you need because it primes your user. Attentional bias is another one where the user's thoughts will filter what they pay attention to. So if you have an app, for example, and you want your user to think about, taxes, for example, TurboTax is going to have a user interface that is much different than QuickBooks, even though they're both considered fine tech apps. So that's how I pull from psychology when it comes to the actual design part of it, is actually thinking about what are some of the cognitive biases and principles that I learned, and how are they being used in design, or how can they be used in design, which is like probably the most fun part of my job, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating and probably one of the most, I agree with you, one of the most exciting and fascinating parts of design and product work is, how can, some of those things be applied and be thought about just in product design and product development. I guess going along those same lines and kind of going back to, some of the things that you were touching on and a little bit of your bio that we brought up at the beginning, being a trauma-informed psychologist turned trauma-informed product researcher. What does that mean to you to be trauma-informed, both in psychology and in design?
Yeah. Well, I just love the fact that you did trauma-informed in both of those, because you can't really get rid of the trauma-informed once you've started. So that's definitely important. So trauma-informed psychologist has a little bit more of a practical piece to it, which is that you actually go through a certain amount of courses so that you learn about trauma, you learn about toxic stress, you learn about its effects on the body. What trauma-informed psychology for me was really geared towards children, and really geared towards, again, those adverse childhood experiences, which is namely that, there's 10 possible places where a child's trust can be broken as from an adult to a child. I don't need to go through them, but anyways, neglect, child abuse, things like that. And for me, that was really important as a psychologist, because from 0 to 5, we build this thing called, attachment. And that's basically our foundation to how we go about our adult life. And so when I started thinking about attachment and how that was important to apps and websites, it was the same thing, right? Like our neurons are firing the same way when we use an app that we like as they do when we meet up with a person. It's bizarre, but it's true. If you stripped away everything and you just saw our brain and our neurons firing, it would be the same thing. Oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, all that stuff is firing around just the same as when you play a video game as it is when you see a best friend. So not to strip away all of that, but that is basically what I did, was just kind of focus on the neuroscience, and then the consumer neuroscience of it was oh, so that's where the trauma informed of UX comes in, is thinking about the consumer neuroscience, because that's what UX is all about, right? How do we get people to use something more often? So I started to just kind of take that trauma informed part and be I'm a mom. I'm stressed out. And when I look at my Safari on my iPhone, I have to reach all the way up to the top. This was before the update came in. I'd have to reach all the way up to the top to type into the search bar with one hand and a baby on the hip. Not possible, right? And so I was just beyond thrilled when they finally put the search bar on the bottom, so that when I could do it with my thumb. I was like, this is brilliant, finally. So kind of just thinking about how people enter into this world and enter into an app is really the same thing. How we build an attachment in those, first 5 years, and it can be disrupted. It can be horrible, but we still build, right? We still heal, hopefully, from that, and we become resilient. And so I just kind of took that with the UX piece and was like, Well, we're all still stressed. We're all still having maybe some level of toxic stress. And some of us are traumatized, right? Like some of us are, maybe domestic violence victims, and we need an app that we can easily, have a safe friend. We have all of our stuff on there. We have, it can't live in a notebook, right? We have to think about that type of stuff. You can create it and hide your email right away. Like just things like that you can really think about. And yes, it's for 5% of the population, but that 5% of the population just so happens to use your product 99% of the time. And I think that is the trauma-informed part that I always remember, is that being a trauma-informed psychologist, I only saw a sliver of folks, and that was on purpose. And I saw them deeply, right? So like I saw cancer patients, but I saw them from the start of when they first got their diagnosis all the way until I was doing at home and attending their wake, right? And then going to see their family. So I went deeper. And I think that trauma-informed design needs to do that. It needs to just go deeper into one audience rather than trying to get all of the audience. Like Google will never be trauma-informed because it designs for the next billion users. Mm-hmm. So you have to think about like, what type of places are trauma informed? And I think that's where I started to realize there are probably companies that don't realize that they're holding a lot of folks with trauma. Like Wells Fargo, for example, may not realize that when you turn on your app and you've got all this stuff about first-time home buyers and blah, 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 like you have people that just committed bankruptcy, or you have folks that like are just coming up from the system trying to buy a home, but they have an account with you. Why with all the new home buyer stuff, right? Or like, why with the photos of real people instead of doing like the icons and things like that? I don't always see myself in the Wells Fargo app. And that's frustrating and daunting for me. And I need to check up on my finances, but I will straight up avoid it sometimes because I don't want to see another thing about new home ownership. Like, I live in San Francisco, this new home ownership of like 3% down is like not possible. Yep. So get it right. My location, get it right. And I think that's the trauma-informed part, is that we have to get it right. And we have to focus on getting it right, not just sort of getting it right and then iterating, but really like get the user in there, get it right. So yeah, that's my spiel on trauma-informed.
Yeah. And agree so much. And I think you've touched on so many great points. We talk on this show fairly frequently about the idea of inclusivity in product development. And I think you've touched on a really interesting part of that maybe we don't bring out quite as frequently. And this was in one of the discussions and on a blog post on your site as well, the idea of emotional inclusivity that I think you've highlighted or started to highlight really well. Maybe you can kind of touch more on that. Like, what does that mean to you, and how does being more emotionally inclusive mean to you, and how can we do that more in UX and in product development?
Yeah. So it's just kind of similar to inclusivity in general, which is, right, accepting all backgrounds and all abilities. And this is the same thing. We accept all emotions. We don't just design for delight and enjoyment and enhancement. We design for reducing something, right? Like maybe our app actually is focused on reducing something rather than enhancing something. But to have that type of conversation is a little bit nerve-wracking. And it's the same type of nerve-wracking that probably happens when you say we need to accept all backgrounds and all abilities. Oh my gosh, what does that mean, right? It's so big. But with emotional inclusivity, it's really about putting emotional intelligence into practice. So it can mean something like giving space for your user to learn and practice self-awareness. I was using this awesome app called Fabulous, and I love it. And in the onboarding, it makes you do a contract, but you have to tap until it like lights up, right? So you're tapping and you're smashing away at this button like, I definitely am in this. I'm doing this. I'm totally committing. But it was that interaction and that tapping that made me be like, I'm connecting to that emotion of like, I am so ready to break habits, or I'm so ready to start new habits. And this is the app that's going to do it. Right. So it got an emotional pull from me, but it also recognized that I might be coming in with some serious doubt. Like this is probably not my first rodeo. This is probably, one of those moments where I'm like, yeah, I've done this before. Like, here we go again. There might be some negative self-talk. And so the design of it made it so I couldn't concentrate on that self-talk. I was pushing this button too frantically to like make the like circle light up. So they recognize that. And I think that's a great example of emotional inclusivity is we recognize all the emotions. And we also recognize, and here's what's different than most inclusivity things, is that the emotions come and go. And so we have to recognize that the joy will leave, right? Like that's okay. That's what we want. And we don't want lifelong users. Oh my gosh, like that's something that we don't want to talk about, right? But we do have to talk about emotions coming and going if we talk about emotional inclusivity. It's a little different than we talk about regular inclusivity. But I hope this is a new conversation that we have, that we just have to accept all emotions. It's really important.
Yeah, I think it's really good and really interesting because it's probably something that we, at least from my perspective, aren't talking about as probably not as frequently, but it's an important part of the conversation because, like you said, it's part of the overall product development, and the UX is understanding the emotional part of both the UX and the product and the user experience, and what our users are going through, and understanding that and being able to accept those emotions and the range of emotions, and being able to both design for that and understand, how both we can be impacting our users and what our users can be experiencing while using the app, kind of like you were talking about, both with like the Wells Fargo experience and with the other app, I lost the name of it there, but with the Habit app that you were talking about, both really good examples. Are there other examples that come to mind, either in apps or things that you have used, or apps or software that you've helped other people create that have been either really good or that have needed work, that have maybe brought some of these concepts together that come to mind? I guess what has been some of your experience in bringing all of this together, some of these things that we've talked about?
Yeah. I think that there's a couple of experiences that I can definitely bring up that have managed to put the trauma-informed work, which is kind of like the pre part. And then there's this restorative design, which is kind of like the doing, where you recognize the trauma and you say, okay, we're gonna design to heal for that. We're gonna design to repair that rupture. And then after that is this thing that I like is, it's like a magic moment, but it's receptional design. And it's this moment of reception where you receive a product or you receive a service. And Tina Sharkey has an amazing TED Talk on this, but she talks about how when she was hiking once, she had worn this sweater for many, many times. And it was just this one day she had super cold hands and she unrolled the sleeves. And in there was a little tag that said, "Cold hands, warm heart." And she's like, I've worn this so many times, but it was right there in that moment that I needed to hear that, see that. And it was perfect because I also needed to warm my hands. So it was a moment where she received the product, which was this, this sleeve rolling down, turning into hand covering. But she also received it on a different level, which was like a hidden tag that like gave a message of affirmation. And she gives another really good example in that TED Talk, which is of Uber. So Uber does a really good job at receptional design too, where they say, we know that you're going to need a car. And we also recognize that there's some folks who may be like having serious anxiety of like, how long is it going to be until my car gets here, especially if they have travel anxiety. So they recognize that and they show you all of the cars that are around you. And so you can see all of them, even though you know you're only getting one driver, you still see like all of these like 15 million cars around you. And so you have this sense of like, okay, phew, like there's a ton of drivers around me, no big deal. There's that driver of yours could be totally off the map, right? Like it could be on its way to you, no doubt, that's true, but could be totally off the map. But you do not receive that, right? You receive the fact that there are multiple cars waiting to service you, no big deal. Whew, you can calm down. So I think that those two that I listed are that she listed are really good ways of like bringing it all together. And then for me, one of the ones that I've been loving, I mentioned Fabulous, which I think is really great. And it, like I said, it kind of takes this, the onboarding is like a story and you're like part of a movie. And so right away, your first name is part of a movie and you're a character that goes on this journey. And the character is a little bit amorphous, so it doesn't look like an actual person, but you still have real like landscapes and journeys and things like that that you actually go through. And what's really great about this is like it's a habit task builder. And if you want to build or add another habit, because I know we all get like, okay, I'm on day 5, let me add another habit. It will make you change your journey. It will say, okay, that's fine, but you'll need to change your journey. Are you okay with that? And for me, I'm like, no, I'm on day 14 of the first journey. Like, why would I want to start from 0 on another one? You know? Yeah. So it kind of, again, takes into this idea of like, okay, that's fine. Your decision is fine, but this is what it means. And are you okay with that? And I think another app that does a great job is Truebill. I love using Truebill for 2 reasons. One is the savings part, which is not a fixed savings. Like it doesn't say like, okay, we're going to save 3% of whatever you spend, or we're going to save $5. It will like put in like $7.17, and then it will put in like $12.03. But at the end, it will send me this email that's like, congratulations, you've saved $200. And I'm like, how did I do that? Like right on, you know? And so it takes out the work for me because it recognizes that I'm probably visiting this app wanting complete concierge help of my expenses and my savings. I don't want to decide how much I'm going to save because I want AI to do that for me, right? I want somebody who knows my bank accounts. I'm giving you all this information, like do something with it, right? And so they do. And the second thing that I love about it is they'll cancel subscriptions. They'll go through all of your subscriptions and be like, you know, hey, we can get you a better deal on your insurance. Do you want us to cancel it for you? And I'm like, yes, please. Amen. Go for it. And then they do the whole process for you. Like, that is awesome. I could go online and do it myself. Super easy. Cancel it anytime. Yes, I know. But that's like 5 steps that I actually don't have to take. And then it's an additional 5 steps I don't have to take to be like, is it Progressive? Is it Allstate? Oh no. Somebody else does it for me. And then they're just like, okay, we just need your this and this and this. And it's all by text. So again, it's not like, you know, this person I have to call and all this other stuff. So they recognize that I'm busy and I probably need full concierge. And that being said, they kind of treat me like I'm this like rock star and they make me feel like, sweet, you know, Truebill will handle it. I actually call it Bill because I like to feel like I'm some rock star. So I'm like, I don't know, I got to ask Bill. So I think that those are the two apps that are kind of having these moments where I still have moments where I'm receiving their product, where I'm like, ooh, that was awesome. Like that was really cool. So those are 2 of the products I think are really killing it right now.
Wow. No, that's really good. So just to, I guess, kind of highlight some of what you said, where we go from the trauma informed, which is kind of like understanding before, yeah, to the restorative, which is restoring, I guess, for lack of to define it by itself, to receptional, which is receiving the product. And you've given some really great examples. Is that kind of the way that you see it as far as like the journey or each of the different steps?
Yeah, that's a really awesome question. I still think that is like the product life cycle for me. That is the product life cycle, that it goes through this deep understanding of the trauma and the experience of the user. And then you plan and strategize to healing that. And how are you going to leave the user better than when you found it? Not because it's your responsibility, but because the user is choosing that. right? So I think that's the important part, is the user chooses that through using your app or using your services. And then, then you start to say, how can they receive this? How can they continue to receive it? Do we have a hidden tag? Do we recognize that their cart has a jersey in there? And then when they pop back on, whoop, 10% off, right? Like, how do we make sure that they continue to receive that? A lot of times when folks leave something in their cart, it's not because they don't want it. It's because they're thinking about the affordability of it. How do we know that? Well, because we've done research on that, right? And so it's not about keeping folks on the page and making them, do that. It's about affordability. Let's give them a pop-up coupon right away, right? 10% off this purchase, not your next purchase, not like come back with this, but this purchase right here, right now, because you're here right now, not because we want to keep you coming back. So I think that the reception part of all of that, and all of that, honestly, the trauma informed, the restorative, and the reception part is similar to what I had touched upon earlier. We don't want lifetime people, right? As a psychologist, I don't want a lifetime client. Like, I want you to get better. And so I think that's what my approach is really about, is like, yeah, use my app, please, whatever, have thousands of downloads because it's 99 cents. That's great. But get better, right? Like, get better and stop using it, and then tell your friends how this app helped you, but then you stopped using it, right? That's what I want. I want the story. I want the story that comes after.
Yeah. No, that's great. That makes perfect sense. So what do you see coming next for, I guess, not only what you're doing, but maybe for the design industry or UX generally? Do you see any new trends or exciting things coming down the pike?
Yeah. I'm always skeptically optimistic about the tech pipeline, but what I do see is I see more folks from different backgrounds coming into UX research and design, and that makes me feel really, really good, right? I love the different backgrounds that are coming in. I love that there's more psychologists coming and saying like, hey, how did you do this? Like, I kind of don't want to do psychology anymore, but I don't want to, like, you can't unforget, right? You can't forget and unlearn psychology. So I love hearing that, there's more psychologists that want to do this work too, because that makes me feel like we're putting more people into tech. And I also love that there's more cross-functional conversations happening. There's more software engineers that are on Discord having these conversations of like, hey, I want to program this, but like, this seems off, right? Like, this is just not seem right. And so there's more conversations. The Discord channel Empathy in Tech, if you haven't heard of it, is amazing. Andrea Gauthier is the founder and Casey Watts is a moderator. That whole Empathy in Tech network is fantastic. I highly plug them, recommend them. The other thing that I really do see happening is like a regulatory arm is going to somehow have to be built for these Googles and Facebooks of, are you really being user-centered? Like, are you really being user-centered? And there's a part of me that's kind of like, hey, I want to create the IRS arm of that and go in and like audit the crap out of these people, right? And just be like, no, Amazon, like you're not doing it, And so I kind of see that is going to be a need. Who steps up? I don't know, right? We don't have like an FDA of tech. We don't have that. We don't have people saying like this app is doing harm. And so I don't know, but I do see that being a need, and I see it becoming kind of problematic if we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I think the other thing I see is that more people are starting to talk about empathy, and they're starting to actually need empathy. So our designers and researchers are needing empathy. And I think that is huge. Like, we are building a little bit more time in between projects where we can celebrate that, like, we had a successful kickoff. Like, awesome. Let's not jump right into the next like weekly scrum, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's celebrate the kickoff. So I think like, having Slack and platforms like that are allowing us to communicate and send, gifts and things like that we can have those moments of celebration and not be such a quick culture. I do see tech slowing down a little bit in that way of like, maybe 5 to 7 is great, but let's try to get 10 to 12 user research, right? And that takes a little bit more time. So I think that it's just now starting, but I do see a shift happening. And I think it's just more conversations in spaces like this that you've created, Kyle, that really kind of keep that conversation, keep that train moving. So thank you. Yeah.
I tend to agree with you, and I hope so, because that's definitely a trend that I feel as well, and hope continues, that just more empathy in general and more understanding both of users and people creating, because that's something that I think we continue to desperately need more of, and just more human centered in pretty much everything that we're doing. That it's all about the people that we're creating for and that are doing the creating, and that we're all people and we're all in this together, and I don't know, it's not a zero sum game that we're all competing against each other. Like we're all in this together. I don't know how else to say that. Like we need to like build each other up and have it's a community of all of us, and we can all win as a group and as humanity. Now, hopefully we can end that on a high note, but let's be a community of people and not tear each other down.
Gosh, yes. Let's build capacity instead of trying to win each other up on how much capacity we can take.
Yep.
Yeah, let's do that.
Awesome. Well, Dr. G, this has been an amazing conversation. I feel like we could probably continue it for a lot longer. You've made some absolutely amazing points, and I've written down a whole bunch of notes and different things, but really appreciate it. I guess before we move on to a last couple of questions that I have for you, is there anything else, any final thoughts that you have on UX, on product development, on design, on anything else?
I would just say, if you are a new researcher, a new designer, and you want to have more conversations like this, don't be afraid to reach out, right? Don't be afraid to reach out to myself, to the Andrea Goutiers, the Indy Youngs, the Rachel Deet-Kisses. You know, we see you on LinkedIn, and I think that we really just want more young researchers and more upcoming researchers and designers to have this conversation. You don't need to be a decision maker. You don't need to be senior. Yeah, you might not be able to implement all the stuff that we talk about, but you can implement it in your life and in your brain, and they're the next generation. So my door is wide open. My inbox is wide open as well.
Awesome. Well, that's great. All right. We've got a couple final questions for you to kind of wrap it up. Any interesting things that you have watched or read or seen recently?
I just finished the empathy essays, and I'm trying to think. Let's see. Leslie Jameson. That's who wrote it. So Leslie Jameson, The Empathy Exams. Highly recommend it. It's a really great book. I reread recently The Design of Everyday Things. It gets a little bit more cringeworthy. Like the more you read it, the further away as it gets from the origin. I appreciate it. I really do. But I just, there's a couple of things in there that I just want to like open up a conversation for folks to see like what their reactions are. So rereading that was interesting. And then completely not related to UX was reading When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. And, you know, when you're talking about empathy and you're talking about psychology and all of this stuff, you can't not read about it. You have to continue to read about, you know, grief and those places and those uncomfortable parts. And so one of the things that I have kind of taken from that book is this impermanence and how it's a mark of existence. And I love that idea because when you're in UX research and design, you kind of forget that like you're creating this static thing out there, like a website or an app, but everything else around it changes, right? Like your users change, your platform changes, your context changes. And so just kind of being reminded that, you know, we're all humans. And everything changes, like everything changes. So yeah, those are my couple of things.
So true. Yeah, that's so good. I'll have to check those out. It's been a while since I've read the design of everyday things too.
Good.
Yeah, may have to revisit some of that, but yeah, it's definitely an older book too. So
it is. Yeah. And you appreciate it for its wisdom and its sage, for sure.
Definitely. You've, all right, last question. You've definitely given us a whole bunch of apps and we'll link a bunch of those, but is there anything else that you have, any products or apps or anything that you've been using and enjoying, or that you've been using and hating recently?
So I think I've shared the ones that I've been using that I've loved. A couple of my friends have been talking and colleagues have been talking about Reddit as not being the greatest of spots. Apparently, I don't use Reddit, so I don't know. But apparently, when you have a direct message, you can only send photos. You can't send any other media. And so they were saying like it's almost like you say, hey, come in, but then you shut the door before anybody else can get into your house. And so, I think what I'm saying if there's any platform out there that allows for direct messaging and you're only allowing static images to be shared, you're really stifling the relationship and basically showing users the door, because they'll engage on your platform, but if they're engaging because of a direct message interaction, they're eventually going to stop because it's too much work. Like how else do you share your videos or what have you? You have to use a different platform. So anyways, if you're trying to put it all in one, really put the messaging part, put the media sharing in there and make it, really pay attention to what other messaging apps are doing, because I think they might be losing some folks.
So yeah, no, that's so true. Especially now when sharing everything is so ubiquitous across so many different things.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. And across cultures too, which is so big. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, where can people find out more about you and everything that you're doing?
Yeah. So, I have my website, drgslab.com. I'm really active on LinkedIn. So please find me on LinkedIn, Dr. G. That's it, just Dr. G. And those are my two places. I am on the Discord channel, Empathy in Tech. If you guys want to check out Empathy in Tech and get an invite there. I love having conversations on Discord. I think it's a great platform, especially for these types of conversations. So please find me.
Okay. All right. Dr. G, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking with you. And we'll put all those links in the show notes. And thanks again.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. And thanks everybody for listening. Thanks again for listening. If you like the show, be sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can follow the show on Twitter @ProdByDesign. That's prod_by_design. You can follow me @Kyle Larry Evans on Twitter as well. If you want more product conversation, check out my newsletter, Product Thinking, at productthinking.cc. You can follow me on Medium @Kyle Larry Evans as well, or check out my Medium publication, Product by Design. Thanks again.